A warm welcome to all of you. For those who don't know me, my name is Ju Chong. I'm the director of the Electoral Regulation Research Network. The network, as most of you are aware, aims to provide a forum for debate and discussion on research relating to electoral regulation. And of course, when we think about electoral regulation, we think one of the most controversial topics, some would say, the most controversial topic concerns the role of money in politics. And we see that illustrated in the recent episodes relating to the federal election, from the Prime Minister's donation to controversy about paraphilia, and of course the ongoing investigation by the Independent Commission against New South Wales Independent Commission against Corruption in Operation Spicer and Operation Credo. So this is an important topic for us to tackle, and an important feature of the network is that it seeks to really bring together academics, Electoral Commission officials, and other persons who are actually undertaking research in this area. And I think this particular event really brings nicely together those two aspects of debating and discussing important topics, and not have that confined to those who are actually affiliated to an academic institution. We have today Neil Freestone, who has a fascinating bio. I think he's qualified in both economics and law from Monash University. He's worked as a legal practitioner in a range of contexts, and he's also an author, written a short story called Yellow Shells, and also a short story called Crossroads about two refugees. But those are not the books that are of our immediate concern today. The particular book of our concern is the book that Neil has written that proposes a political donations and safeguards code. So please join me in welcoming Neil, and Neil will speak for about half an hour or so, and then we'll open it up for questions, discussion.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Ju Chong and Catherine, for organising today's event, and of course to everybody to come along. I certainly appreciate your interest in this subject. There was a handout there. I hope everybody picked up the handout on the way in. It has a few dot points, etc. in there, which I won't spend too much time going over today. But in the interest of trying to put things into perspective, I'll read from some notes I've made, and I may leave some out to try and carve off 10 or 15 minutes so that we can have plenty of discussion time at the end of it, and then everyone can get away on time. So as indicated in the invitation to today's seminar, the book that I thought I might as well make it as a book, because I don't know that I'll be visiting the area again for a little while, but it was going to be basically a working paper of some sort, but I thought it might be better if it was made a book and had its ISBNs, etc., so that any of you wanting to have a closer look at the approach that I've taken can access it fairly easily. It's now out there on Australian Policy Online, I think, and the Quarterly Review have published a précis of the approach as well just recently. So hopefully it will become part of a platform that can lead to a fruitful discussion where we might see some real change. And just speaking with Ju Chong earlier, the question is, what are you hoping to achieve when you set out to do something like this? Well, I guess my travels started when I was still at university, and I could see then that there was troubles with the political donations and appointments of various people into various government organisations, the winding back of the railways, all sorts of different things irritated me. And those little things build up over time, and I guess after 30 or 40 years working, you turn around and those things are still there. And so I thought, well, if I could just allow myself to take the step and say, well, if you could throw everything we're doing at the moment away, what would you have in its place? Well, number one, I thought you'd have something that the politicians can't touch, not very easily anyway. And number two, you would want to get the money, the big money, out of politics. Now, of course, that immediately says to anybody who's listening, oh, well, he's not a blue wool capitalist or a Donald Trump or somebody like that. Perhaps he's a communist or he might be a socialist, or is he one of us? I thought, well, I don't care about all that, because it really depends where one person stands against the other on one issue as to whether they're left or right or centre or whatever. So I put all of that to one side and I said, no. Throughout my time as a solicitor in Orbost, I ran a trust account for 29, 31 years. I lost count after a while. And we received money from clients to do things that the clients wanted to do. The thing was audited once or twice. The bank put a couple of costs onto our trust account that it shouldn't have. It should have gone into the office account. And bingo, you have to declare that the fact that it's not in balance. But apart from a couple of those little $10 things here or $20 things there, I think there's only 2 of them, the system worked very, very well. Clients gave us the money to do something with, get some title searches, pay a deposit to somebody, pay a settlement sum to somebody on the purchase of their house, their life savings. And we did that. And it was not a problem. And I thought to myself, well, why couldn't the Australian Electoral Office do what every solicitor is asked to do with their trust accounts? Why couldn't they? Of course, it'll take some money. That's easy to find. I know where we're going to get most of that from. And the answer I came up with was, well, they can do it. They can do it. Every time an elector becomes an elector, such as a child turning from, or a youth turning from 17 and a lot to 18, the Australian Electoral Office could automatically enrol that person as an elector. The Australian Electoral Office, at the very instant after that person is enrolled, set up that person's trust account. And it might be dormant. That person may never, ever want to donate money to a political party. But that person will have an account, and if that person wants to donate the money to a political party, it will go into the Australian Electoral Office with instructions, and the Australian Electoral Office will ensure that it doesn't breach any of the caps or anything else in our new code. And if it doesn't, then the Australian Electoral Office will move the money from that trust account across to a political party's trust account or a candidate's trust account. And there it will sit until that political party or that candidate chooses to do something with it. And while I'm saying that, I should just take that extra step and also say this includes third parties and associated entities. And it's not difficult to do that either. And so if an elector, let's call him John Smith, if John Smith wants to donate, we've had troubles in the dairy industry, so we'll pick that. If John Smith wants to donate some money to the dairy lobby under this code would need to register with the AEC as a third party group. Once it's registered, it will then have the ability to partake in political expenditure. If it doesn't register, it will not have that right. And then when John Smith makes his donation and he wants it to go to the dairy lobby, he indicates that to the Australian Electoral Office, and the Australian Electoral Office look at the dairy lobby X, and if X is registered, it can receive that donation. And then John Smith can continue to make his donations to the dairy lobby or to anybody else that's registered with the AEC up to his cap. Once he gets to his cap, that's it for that year. So, to me, that, in a nutshell, can help to explain what I envisage as a reasonable way forward to provide us with real-time disclosure, which, if everybody's doing the right thing, we're not even interested in disclosure anymore. It disappears. It provides for the regulation of donations in relation to caps, and it also controls who receives those donations and how they undertake their role in our society. In a nutshell, that's what this is about. And so I thought I might just go through a few of the other issues, one of which driving this is, and I mentioned it earlier, and that is there is the money there already. There's about $60 million every election. The last election was just over, I think, $58 million that Australian government funds. I know we always call it, well, we don't, I don't call it taxpayers' funds, because funding can come from all sorts of different directions when you're a federal government. You can create the money, you can borrow it, and you can draw it in through taxes. You can also get it from public enterprises if you have any that you haven't sold yet. So there are a number of sources of public funds, but let's just call it Australian public funding. At the moment, in the last election where Tony Abbott was involved as Prime Minister, there was something like 58 million, a little bit more than that, paid to the political parties and the candidates that were involved in that election, so long as they received their 4% of the primary vote. Now, if that 50, let's call it $60 million, because I think it'll be over that figure once we see the figures for this election just gone, if that $60 million went to the AEC, it would cover a lot of administrative expenses to run a system like what I've proposed here. And on top of that, the AEC could also act to disperse in a very efficient way electoral paraphernalia material on behalf of candidates that at the moment can't even see the light of day because they can't fund it. If you live in an electorate where there's 100,000 people, and that's pretty average, and you want to send a letter to everybody that's on the roll, and the stamps cost $1 each, well, apart from anything else, that's $100,000, and most people don't have that money. And so if the Australian Electoral Office were to receive from you your electoral material and disperse it free of charge in one envelope with everybody else's material prior to an election, then there would be a huge chance for different people to get their material out to the electorate and to partake in the democracy in the way that they might want to. So there's lots of room for the AEC to do a lot more, and there is a fair bit of money there at the moment for them to do it. It may take more money than what's at present spent on candidates, but it's nevertheless a track that I think is well worthwhile having a look at. Going back to public funding generally, there's a quote that I can't leave alone. It was Mr. Beazley back in 1983 when he was the then Special Minister of State. And there was some discussion prior to the Commonwealth Electoral Legislation Amendment Bill of 1983. There was discussion prior to the moving of that bill into legislation as to all the good reasons why we should have public funding for elections. And in Kim Beazley's speech, he said, and I've just pulled out the relevant sentence, "It is simply naive to believe that no big donor is ever likely to want his cut sometime. And that's at the base of why we fund these parties and candidates up to $60 million every time they have their elections. So the object was that, well, if they're funded by us as the people of Australia, then they won't need the big donations anymore. And with better disclosure, the banks or whoever else it might be who are making these big donations will be so embarrassed about the fact that everybody knows that they'll stop giving. Well, we now know that the banks still give, lots, and to both sides, and we know that the big donations still happen. And in fact, when we go on a little bit further, we find that in, what did I have it as? In 19... I drew a graph actually, which is probably better to look at than anything. Yes, 2009, sorry, to 2010. So it's a long time after 1983. And in that particular AEC year, 7% of the donors contributed 57% of the donations. And it's not a standout year or anything. There's the years for the 2005, 2006, 2007, they're all similar to that. They're all similar. So this public funding hasn't stopped big donations. And so Kim Beazley's idea of the big donor wanting his cut or its cut sometime is still there. And after $60 million, well, why do we bother? So from the public funding issue, I believe that there's a very good argument to move that money across to the AEC for better use. And then we also have other issues too, such as internationals becoming involved and remaining involved in our political system here. I don't know why. I don't know that anyone here too has the answer to this, but you know, how can an English company or an American company or a Chinese company or any company other than Australia expect to have any role in our political system here? We might say, well, globalisation is all about that sort of thing. Okay, well, let's have the global economy. But I don't think we're really ready to throw things away like that. When I looked at that, the United States have a clause in their legislation to say that foreign parties are not to be involved in influencing the elections in America, and I think that reflects exactly what I think most people would expect. And then, of course, with globalisation and all the interchange and intermixing of shareholding and everything else, when we look at our old Commonwealth Bank that we once had before it was sold, two of the major shareholders there, one's based HSBC, the other one's Morgan Stanley, I think. Not Australian creations, they're from elsewhere. Now, I think one of them has 16% or so of the action in the bank, and the other one has something a bit less, but it's well over 10%. So you've got 20 or 25% interest in a bank like our Commonwealth Bank, and then our Commonwealth Bank is giving money to political parties, to both sides of our political equation, both major sides. You can see how indirectly we've got internationals involved in our political system. we're at a stage now where if we don't do something about this, we're watching our petrochemical industry disappear overseas, we're watching our iron and steel industry just about fold up. If sovereignty is of any interest to anybody, if our future identity as a country is of any interest to anybody, then we need to stop those donations being made from internationals. We need to stop it. And to have a balanced system, we need to look at the unions. As the unions, every time we have a go at a major corporation having too much say or sway with our political system, we also find that one side will say, usually the Liberal side, Liberal National side will say to the press or to the other side, well, you look at the CFMEU or you look at your unions. You get all that money from the unions. And it's true. It's true. And then neither of them pursue the arguments. Both sides back off and nothing happens. So with the book that I put together and the thought that was behind it, I've dealt with unions and corporations as being exactly the same. I know they're not, but they get the same treatment. So just as I'm saying that corporations shouldn't be involved in our political system, I'm also saying that unions should not be involved in our political system. Now, having said that, if the corporation has shareholders that are eligible voters, and if a union has union members that are eligible voters, then there is nothing in what I'm proposing that prevents those persons who are eligible voters from making their own contributions to the political party of their choice. For instance, I don't believe that every person who's a union member will vote Labor. I don't believe they do. In fact, I think there's a suggestion that a lot of people don't want to be a union member anymore. Perhaps if this were in place, unions would have to fall back on what they once upon a time did and look after their membership, and they might once again become stronger players. But the way I've approached it is to say no more. An eligible voter should be a person who is an Australian citizen, who's qualified under our federal constitution to vote, and that should be that. So, and that's irrespective of their race or colour or creed or their psychosocial situation. If they're an Australian citizen, they should be able to vote. So if we do all of that, then we need some caps to make this thing work. And the caps need to be, the way I've drafted this, the cap for an eligible voter is not right. So there's some work to be done. I've just pulled out some benchmarks basically to put them in there and get it going, but even when I did it, I was not very happy with what I did there. I basically said, look, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, can and should every year tell us what the median average weekly wage is for a full-time worker in Australia, and also the median average annual wage is for a full-time worker in Australia. And once the Australian Electoral Commission is advised of those figures become what we use in the code to determine our donations and our expenditure. The donations, I've said in my work here, would be equal to 1 week's median average weekly wage for a full-time worker in Australia. And that's not workable. It's not workable. When the US had their elections recently, that's not right, is it? They're still in their electoral process. They go on forever. When they had their selections for the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders was was saying that the average donation he received towards his run at the nomination for the presidential candidacy was $27, I believe, if my memory serves me correctly. $27. If you multiply that by our exchange rate at the moment, we're looking at $30 or $35 Australian. That would be the average donation. Well, that's a long way south of 1 week's median average weekly wage for a full-time worker in Australia. Long way south. So I'm thinking that possibly we need to be looking at something like 1/10 of that figure as the cap. And that's not difficult to change anything, of course. It's just a collection of ideas to get us perhaps more focused. But we might be looking at 1/10 of that figure, which would then, it would need to be modelled, but my thoughts are that you would want the modelling to suggest to you that at least 90% of your population had the disposable income sufficient to make some non-mandatory expenditure equal to the maximum of that political donation. So you might have to make some social choices when you do the number crunching. You might say, well, look, if they don't drink to excess and they don't smoke to excess and they have all the average expenses, how much have you got left? In the old-fashioned economics, we used to call it the marginal propensity to save. What is the marginal propensity to save of the average population that's within, say, 90%, that 90% parameter? That's going to change from time to time. And so that's going to be an issue as to how you can structure a formula that's going to fit nicely from year to year to year. At the moment, I've just started with a very basic shell there. And the same goes with the political expenditure side of things. I've basically said in my work that that would be equal to 1 year's median average annual wage per candidate. That gives us something to start with anyway. Political parties will say, well, that's not enough. We want to be able to spend more than that. So if let's just say it's $50,000, our magic wage figure for this year, that's not going to go very far for one candidate. However, if you have the AEC doing a fair bit of your propaganda delivery for you, perhaps you don't need as much as you needed at the last election per candidate. But perhaps it's a long way south of what a reasonable amount should be. So perhaps we need to be looking at a multiple of that particular figure. And then there's another issue which I haven't covered in the work, and that talks about a candidate. And then in this work we're talking about applying this new model to every electorate in Australia, which of course would include local council elections. And then you say, well, there's candidates in local council elections that are not aligned to political parties at the moment, perhaps some are. But unless you tightened up things here, you would have a proliferation of candidates in all sorts of different electorates being put there simply to bolster the amount that you can spend as a political party for an election if it's on a per candidate basis. So I think that the way forward would be to say, well, it can be on a per candidate basis. It might be equal to the annual average or the median annual average wage. It might be by 2 or by 3, but on a per candidate basis where those candidates are only at the House of Representatives or Senate level federally, or at a state parliamentary level and nothing below. I think that would work better. So you can see that this is still a work in progress, but I believe it would be a lot better than what we have at the moment. How am I going for time? Probably nearly half an hour, and I haven't followed my notes at all. Some of the safeguards, I'll just briefly touch on those before I finish, but some of the safeguards do include having an arbitration commission, a Commonwealth Arbitration Commission, to sort out disputes, because I'm sure there'll be disputes between candidates and political parties in the AEC, perhaps even occasionally with donors, in respect to a direction to go and spend some money on some advertising or something, and it doesn't happen and everybody gets cranky. And so you need some very efficient arbitration commission to just deal with those issues very quickly and at no cost to the complainant who's asking for the review. Plus there's also, of course, the review to the High Court. There also is a provision for the something like the New South Wales ICAC. At the Commonwealth level we don't have anything, and some feedback I've already had on that from New South Wales, or no names mentioned, suggested, well, if anything happened in that regard, we wouldn't want it, what we're doing in New South Wales, watered down to some lesser type body here, well, in the operating for the Commonwealth and for the whole system. So, and that's fair comment too. If New South Wales represents best practice, then our ICAC should be nothing less than, the Commonwealth ICAC should be nothing less than that. And there are other safeguards as well. Well, I'm going to stop talking, I think, for a moment. What do you think? Sean?
Yeah. Look, I think I should say, I think you should be congratulated for sort of wading into this controversial area and wading in a way with a big splash, if you like, by sort of proposing your code. I'm going to take the privilege of chair to ask you some questions, if you like, to sort of press you a bit further.
Certainly.
Look, my first, well, three questions I want to ask, or three sets of questions. One was, I still can't, it is a nuts and bolts proposal, and I think that's really important, very essential. But what I can't get a grip of is what's actually driving this. You know, are we, usually in this area, other people think about preventing corruption or promoting fairness, or they think about promoting transparency as a virtue in itself. So I couldn't quite get a grip as to, with these particular proposals, what were they actually directed to? Because it goes to the question about whether desirability, of course. You know, it's not just a question whether proposals are workable, it's actually, do they actually advance particular democratic outcomes? And then the second set of questions actually goes to the proposal to really essentially ban foreigners from donating, right? I think this is an important part of your proposal. Well, two thoughts come to mind. One is that essentially that provision was struck down by the High Court in New South Wales. It was actually a New South Wales provision that actually was struck down. But the second comment I'll make as a matter of principle is why do we see that as a problem? I mean, let me, even before the High Court decision, I wrote a report for New South Wales Electoral Commission criticizing the provision on its merits for two reasons. One is that when we think about this Australian community, it's not just citizens that are part of the Australian community. Most of us, if not all of us, will include permanent residents. So your proposal will actually knock out permanent residents who are actually participating in an important form of political activity. And it's not just permanent residents, because what you see is a transformation in the migration profile in Australia, where there are quite a lot of long-term temporary residents on 457 visas, for example. But the other part I'll say is that what's the problem with people acting through corporate entities, whether it be unions or companies? How they do it is a different question, but what is the problem in itself? I mean, our politics are organized through groups and intermediaries. So why do we see that as a problem in itself? So this is the second set question. The third one, which is just very briefly, and you didn't talk about it that much, but it's actually in your, because you actually proposed, I think in the second draft, how the Commonwealth exclusive powers under the Australian Constitution would need to be expanded. And the question is really if you could expand on that expansion.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I might start with that one first.
Sure, yeah.
And it ties into the issue with foreigners donating as well. At the moment, you couldn't bring in what I'm looking at here without a change to the federal constitution. The states all have their rights, as we we probably know, to make their own laws in relation to electoral matters. And they can all get together, of course, and agree to hand those rights on to the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth can then go forward with one collective proposal. That might in fact be, if this goes anywhere, that might in fact be something that's well and truly considered before any referendum change. But at the moment, the exclusive power for the Commonwealth to involve itself in electoral matters does not exist. And so, I think it was section 52 I was looking at there, it would need to be expanded to specifically enable the Commonwealth to act completely within that space. And only if the Commonwealth can act within the electoral space can we stop what we've seen in New South Wales, between New South Wales and the Commonwealth, can we stop the leakage that happens when you have one jurisdiction tighten up donation laws and we've seen how another jurisdiction is used to make what could be apparently a legal donation, and then that body donates money back to an organisation in another jurisdiction, and it may very well be legal. And so that's what I call leakage. That's that $4 million business that we're looking at with the New South Wales Electoral Commission and the Liberal Party at the moment, a little bit more than 4 million. Those sorts of things happen all the time, and not often are they caught. So, and when they are caught, are they breaking the law, or are they just stretching it? Are they just working within it? I thought that, and with some of the court cases too about foreigners and things like that, it's probably time that if you don't have the law clearly and in place, and especially perhaps by way of a constitutional amendment, then you will have the court cases saying that, yes, the foreigners can come in and organise the Australian political system for Australians. Am I a nationalist because I sort of put it like that? I don't know. But I think we all love our own little country, and this country is a very open country for people. It's not, we know what it's like. It's a great country to be in, and we don't want to see it change. Would it be like this without major donations from foreign parties? I would think that it probably would. But when it comes to, say, building submarines or something like that, there's so much misinformation out there. But if we have political decisions on tenders that are made where money is coming from foreign parties, and the tender is let in a foreign country, and a couple of facts line up, and the electorate says, oh, well, you know, France gave that money via a donation to the Australian government. The French are building our submarines, therefore the French have corrupted our Australian political system. Couldn't be farther from the truth in most issues and situations, I would think. But it doesn't give a good look to things. The Americans want only Americans to be involved in funding their political system. I think they're right. That's a personal view. That's the view I've put through here. If we all look after ourselves in relation to our own political structures, and then through our foreign aid and our United Nations and our international activities, we can hopefully bring in those that don't sort of quite fit the mould at the moment, but hopefully we can show them that there's a good future in being proud of their own country and also being part of the broader community. So I've gone off
No, that's all right.
the amendment to the Constitution a little bit, but I cannot see anything like this code having any real strong legal basis unless we change the Constitution. And I'm thinking that perhaps we're nearly ready for it, although this code is far too long for that to receive the public support that it would need.
Might open it up to Ken and then.
Ken Cogle from the Accountability Roundtable. Thanks very much, Neil. It's a really interesting set of proposals that you put before us. And I think it's really useful for the public debate to have ideas like this. In your presentation, you've referred to political expenditure and a cap on that, but not described what expenditure would be covered by that provision. I'm wondering if you can comment on that a bit, particularly in the context of some other jurisdictions in which there is no paid television advertising, for example, which is a major expenditure in Australia. And then also if you look at some others which have tight caps, they capture things like union officials on salary going off campaigning on behalf of a political party. So the cost of that is counted as part of the expenditure which is capped. So just those couple of examples, I'm just wondering if you can outline what you would see as being caught by this expenditure cap.
Yes.
So what I might do, I might grab a few questions from maybe 2 or 3 persons and then I'll come back to you, Neil. Is that all right? Yeah. Okay. Morris?
Just to take up some of the points that you made, I suppose in a forum like this, the important thing is to get to the basics of what we think is wrong, and we've got a very good collection of people here. Are we saying that there are 2 real problems? One is which, the second of which perhaps is the nexus between high political, people giving a lot of money to a political party and that political party giving in response commercial deals to that company, such as was revealed in the Commission Against Corruption in New South Wales, where the people in government could virtually give commercial interests the big. So it's the corruption issue at the bottom of it that is a problem. And to me, the other thing in the current system is the problem of rich people within the government, whether it's Trump or Turnbull, who apparently, I think it's now accepted that he put $100 million into the campaign. So that rich people who want to be in government can use their extreme riches, which of course puts them in a different category of the rest of us, to effectively put their money in to help so we get leaders of countries all around the world who are big television owners, or Trumps who are big business people with lots of money, or Turnbull bankers with lots of money. So the system, the actual government is corrupted by money, i.e. people with money become government. Aren't those the 2 basic problems, and isn't the way of tackling them then to go directly to tackle those with the Commissions Against Corruption and limits on, a thorough investigation of the relationship between a political candidate and putting money in for himself as distinct to getting advantage of people who haven't got the money.
You didn't respond to it.
Ken, thinking of it. Sorry.
Yeah. Ken and Morris.
Ken, with your question there, I think political expenditure has been, the definition I've come up with after some research on it it's in clause 13.1 in my work, but it means expenditure for political purposes, so then you have to define a political purpose, and directly related to expenditure on wages, transport, communication, printing, production, publication, display, performance, distribution, broadcasting, advertising, and any other dissemination in any way of any information or material relevant to a political purpose. So that covers things like broadcasting, free-to-air television and all of those sorts of things. It's not drilling down like I think the Canadians drilled down, prevented some television advertising over there and whatever. There's no end to that. I was trying to work out how we could have a system which left sorts of activities as wide open as possible, but then hit that with a cap that's reasonable, and so do whatever you like within that. There's the cap. Good luck. And then even defining the political purpose is not easy. So that's, what have I got there? A public expression of views by any means, a message, an activity of any nature that, in the view of a reasonable person, not in the view of the person who's doing it, but in the view of a reasonable person, can be viewed as opposing, promoting, supporting or advocating for one or more particular candidates, parties, groups, etc., a point of view or a cause or a policy, the development of a particular policy or a new policy, an issue in an election, and a political purpose shall also include the carrying out of the transmission to the public by any means during an election zone of an opinion poll or other research relating to a particular election. And then there's a carve-out to protect the rights, normal political rights that normal people have, that harks back to clause 2.2. The whole thing is interconnected, and in the time that's available to us, it probably doesn't allow us to get into all of that, but that's probably where it needs some finessing to get it right. I think it took an awful lot of time to try and get that right, set the rights up, which we don't have at the moment. There's no political rights set out in our constitution, no personal civil type rights anyway. And so this actually does do that to a degree, which I think is a reasonable degree.
Did you want to respond to Morris's point?
Yes, Morris. The problems that I'm trying to get at that drive me to this particular point where I've done what I have done were that there are large donations. Is it fair or isn't it fair for someone who has millions and millions of dollars, like Malcolm Turnbull, to throw $1 million into an election campaign, when someone equally, with all, say, the same intellect and everything else, but a different point of view on, say, 5 key policies, can only raise $50,000? I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair. I think the way forward for all countries, not just this one, but I'm speaking for this one or in respect to this one, is that we need to get the big money out of politics. And again, I think that's another Bernie Sanders line, or it was Robert Reich or someone like that who said that. Perhaps it was, they were talking together about it one day. And that's what I see as a driver. If we can get rid of the big money out of politics, what we will get rid of at the same time is people paying money and expecting something back, like what Kim Beazley was alluding to back in 1983. I'll give you a donation if you give me the right to build that 30-storey building down the road. So that's one of the issues. The other issue, of course, is having foreign persons involved or foreign corporations involved in making decisions for Australia. There's so much wealth that could be created within Australia if, in my view, my humble view, if it wasn't all sent overseas to be dealt with over there. We say, oh, well, it's cheaper overseas to do all these things. Yes, well, if you had a government that was independent here, independent of all that pressure from overseas, we might have a government that operated like China has in the last 15 years. Lock your currency rate into the US rate. Lock it down. So no matter what the US does, you've got a constant economy where there's not going to be a rise or fall in the Australian dollar in relation to your major trading partner. You can then create your industries. And then if you want to subsidise them with all sorts of things too, you've got your productivity commissions there saying things like we want super productivity, and of course the most productive environment would be that you get out of bed in the morning if that's productive. You look around, everything's done for you, and you go back to bed again. The car's delivered the papers that your son was going to deliver for his paper round. That doesn't happen anymore. Computers do the whole lot. Computers organise the cows to go into the dairy. Computers organise the driverless trucks to pick up the milk. What do we do? So I think the task is that if you have, that's a long bow, but if you come right back to what drives me to do something like this, I see that what we've got to do is slow down a little bit and perhaps look at how we can address the major issues on the planet, number one, use our resources to do those sorts of things, rather than have major corporations just saying, this is what we want, here's the money to run your political campaign, but please let us do what we want to do. Well, if those corporations were interested in cleaning up the Great Barrier Reef issues and all the other things that I see as important, I'd be happy to go and play golf.
Thank you.
My name is Elizabeth Dax. I'm also with Accountability Roundtable, and a novice at this area, I might add. But it seems to me that one of the spin-outs of your suggested scheme would be a far more politically aware and engaged public.
Mm.
And if that was so, it may be a conduit into actually implementing something like this, because you can guarantee politicians would not be interested in your scheme, I would think.
Exactly.
So, the nut of my question is, how on earth would we implement it? And do you think that's the key to it, is to get a more engaged public politically?
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think that's the issue. That's the issue. What I would like to see is for something like this to have the rubbish thrown out of it. I'd like to see the basic nuts and bolts condensed to something that's 4 or 5 pages long, but clear as a bell. If you could do that, that's the first thing. The second thing is you've then got something to put out to the public where you could say through social media, we don't have to put up with all the rubbish, all these big donations and all these foreign influences and all these other things that are perhaps corrupting our system, perhaps, not always, because some of our foreign input, like we all came from other places, or most of us did, even our first Australians, who knows where they came from once upon a time. But we've all come from somewhere, but we're here right now. How do we get this out to the populace? I think if we can condense it, make it into a package that looks like a far better alternative than what we've got right now, and then use it to then have electorates slowly bring the government on board, or politicians generally on board. We don't even need all the House of Representatives to be on board with this. If you had a majority of senators, there's enough room under the current constitution to have the Governor-General put this out to a referendum. But it'll die there if it's too complicated. It really needs to be short and punchy and just the bare bones. It's a really difficult question. I just think it's a starting point. You know, people like Zhu Shong go and do all sorts of very good things in front of joint select committees and whatever. And then we have our politicians cherry pick a couple of things. It's like throwing a few crumbs to the seagulls. And we have a few changes to our Electoral Act every now and then. And we never seem to really have that breakthrough where we have, I'd just like to see the Electoral Act gone and have something very simple with a Commonwealth ICAC there to sort out the corruption around the edges. That would be really nice. It's not an easy path.
We have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Excuse me, David Harper, also from the Accountant Figure Out Table. Taking up Elizabeth's point, how would you sell your scheme to someone seeking to stand as an independent for the Senate, to a Ricky Muir, for example? How would you try and persuade that kind of person that your scheme would work fairly for them? In particular, how would they, what control would they have on any expenditure that they wanted to use in their campaign?
It's a good question. The way I've drafted the code at present would place that independent candidate in a similar position to all other candidates, excepting I think I've got a little bit more leeway there with what they can contribute to their own personal campaign expenses. Beyond that, the only carrot to encourage them to have a look at it and a good think about it would be that if all candidates were dealt with in the same way, the independent candidate would feel far more at ease and on an equal footing with the candidates from the major parties. The major parties have this, it would seem not unlimited amount of wealth behind them, but a lot more purchasing power when it comes to an election to buy themselves the seat in Parliament through advertising and getting those extra votes that they need to form government, to be the member for that electorate or that Senate seat. So what would be the carrot would be the fact that this provides a nearly as level a playing field as you could possibly have for all candidates, and it really pushes to one side political parties. Groups aren't even permitted under what I've drawn up here to raise any money. The candidates do the raising of any funds that are members of those groups. But it really does push to one side the political parties, and it causes them to focus on how much they can spend per candidate in any given year. For the independent candidate, he or she might say, well, I'm not going to be running for local council elections, I'm not going to run for the state, I'll use all my funds just for the federal election. Whereas one of the major parties will say, but this cap applies across all jurisdictions. So we can only spend that budget on local council, state government and federal government. It all comes out of the same, it's all under the same cap. So an independent person running for the Senate might say, well, I could keep a lot of my powder dry. I can actually be in a better position because I'm only going for the Senate seat. I don't have to worry about doing anything in the states or local government-wise. Nothing stopping an independent person standing in those electorates anyway, but again, you need the funds available to put your advertising out and to communicate with your electorate. So the less you do that as an independent, the more you've got left to deal with your Senate campaign. I don't know if I'm answering clearly your question there, David, but my guess is, and my intention is, within this, to bring that independent candidate up to a position where he or she is on a level basis with other candidates, whether they're associated or not.
Well, we might wrap up here and we can continue conversation after.
Dan and I were just talking earlier about the Canadian situation where he was saying that no large donations are allowed to political parties. There's a maximum of $1,500 from individuals and so forth. Do you know how this is working? Is it,
No, I don't know how it's working.
It sounds a good idea.
It does sound like a good idea.
The rank and file of the parties get more say in the policy. In other words, the political party doesn't have to kowtow to some rich and powerful trade.
Well, it helps those even within political parties, doesn't it? Because if you don't have big donors, then the rank and file in the political parties at a branch level will have a greater opportunity to actually have their say. So there are benefits.
Thanks.
Can you all
Yeah.
please join me in thanking you?
So